Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time you're tuning in the program. And you can do this at your leisure. We're going to be doing a live program here at the studio. It's a special program we're doing, and we're taping this one for a later air date. And I hope you will stay tuned for the next hour. I'm going to be talking today about one of my favorite writers, and that is David Horowitz. And if you're not reading David Horowitz, I don't think you really can be even the scholars. I don't think you can be at the top of your game unless you really are reading what David Horowitz is writing. I've read what about 5 of his books, and I think he has about maybe 20 books. I think I counted about 20 books that he's written all together. And this is a major voice. I like him because he's now a conservative, but let's see, the first book I read by Horowitz really was the second book, because the first book was called The Rockefellers and American Dynasty, which he co-wrote with Peter Collier.
You have that book too, huh?
I have that one too, and I read that some time ago. John, you gave me the book by Horowitz called
Radical Son.
Radical Son. That book is very powerful. It really is kind of autobiographical, because what Horowitz is doing in that book is talking about his leanings on the left. He's a radical son, but he had a transformative experience on the left, and now he's a staunch conservative. And it reminds me a little bit of the trajectory of the ideals of Thomas Sowell, because you would not believe Thomas Sowell, who is conservative today, one of the main conservative voices out there today, and has been out there for the last since the 70s. I came in contact with Sowell's writings in the 70s, and it's hard to believe that he was once. I'm talking about Thomas Sowell here now. He was once a Marxist. It's hard to believe that, given how conservative Thomas Sowell is today. It's hard to believe he's ever on the left. And the same thing is true of David Horowitz, because Horowitz is a staunch conservative today. And I brought 2 of his books to the studio. Both of them are classics. Outside of Radical Son, the second book I read by Horowitz, and then I came in contact with his writings when I read the book he co-wrote with Peter Collier called The Rockefellers and American Dynasty. And then this book I just finished a few weeks ago called Final Battle. And I'm going to read some of these excerpts from this book, because this is a groundbreaking work that is very important to what's going on right now. And I want to read some of the things that he says in that book. And if you get a chance and you have some time in your hand and you want to spend it reading, we're not a reading society so much today, but if you really are into reading, I would recommend Horowitz's book, The Final Battle, is certainly a recommended book. And then this book, which came out in 2021 by David Horowitz, is called The Enemy Within. And then the subtitle, How a Totalitarian Movement is Destroying America. And he has on there 7 pictures of those persons that are being called out as part of the radicals that are, in fact, destroying America through this totalitarian movement they have that they are erecting. And on the front cover is Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts. And there's Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House, California. California seems to be spring. California, New York, the 2 coastal areas There's not necessarily in this order, but this order. He put the pictures of these persons. He's saying the totalitarians behind this totalitarian movement. And the third person there is Kamala Harris, the present candidate for president of the United States. And I would agree with those that are saying she's worse than Biden. Not as cognitively impaired as Biden, but she's more dangerous than Biden. And I thought Biden was very, very dangerous. And there's Kamala Harris up there. So the first three that he puts on the cover of the book, Warren, Nancy Pelosi, and Kamala Harris. And below that, Bernard Sanders, from senator from Vermont. And this is really going downhill. You have Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who is now, I read somewhere, she is now worth 29 million. This one came in, she couldn't even pay a rent. She was, you had to have a residency in your district, and then you had the residency in Washington. She couldn't even pay the rent of her residence. Now she's worth $29 million, the last report that I read. So there's Bernie Sanders then on the second tier of these radical leaders. Bernie Sanders, then next to him is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Charles Schumer, and then of the seven on the front cover, there is Schumer, by the way, from New York, and then Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. Minnesota seems to be a beehive of radical figures, because the Attorney General right now, that was once a member of the House, he ran. I think it was one last term, was it, that he ran, and he became the Attorney General of Minnesota. And Minnesota is also the state that has spawned the vice presidential candidate that's running now, along with Kamala Harris. And that ticket right there is one of the most radical tickets ever fielded by a major political party in this country, because you got Kamala Harris up there at the top. And who voted her in? I mean, these people.
Ellison, that's his name, Keith Ellison. Yeah,
Keith Ellison.
Yeah, because I think he's also a Muslim too, isn't he?
He is Muslim.
Yeah. So I mean,
he's a Muslim. He doesn't admit to ties to the Nation of Islam, but that's his affiliation, his Muslim affiliation. It would not be what you call Orthodox Muslim. And Keith Ellison, and now you have Tim Walz, who is the VP candidate. It's just it seems like that state, Ilhan Omar, that state seems to have a lot of radicals that are representing the state. And it raises the question of who are the constituents that are, in fact, voting these persons in. The same thing can be said about Warren in Massachusetts.
I know this is weird though, but I mean, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and it just seems people like in the upper north area, connected nearly to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to be more radical because I remember reading they had like 3 or 4 candidates for the mayor of Milwaukee who have been elected who are socialist over the years. So I mean, there seems to be because I think it's because of the Scandinavian influence. A lot of people there for Scandinavian, they have a tendency to be kind of on the left for some reason. Look at the Scandinavian.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that, because they have a certain kind of socialism in those Scandinavian countries that's a little bit different than what we normally would think about socialism. When I think about socialism, I'm thinking about more Marxian orientation, but they seem like they have it's a mixed kind of political orientation, partially socialist, to some extent capitalist, and a mixture of the two, and not quite. I think socialism is repressive, but not quite as repressive as you would normally associate socialist models. Because when I think about socialism, I'm thinking about models that along the lines of Italy's socialism under Mussolini, and the kind of socialism, if you can call it that, that would be more structured under the if you can claim that that's a socialist model in Russia or Korea, more of a that's kind of like a radical socialism or radical communist system in those states. But I think of Scandinavian countries a little bit more. They have kind of made peace with capitalism as a economic model, and then they kind of have grounded it in a socialist model. And really, I think when I look at Scandinavia, quite frankly, I think that we have given license to their socialism by overly financing, NATO, for example, where they then can spend their money on the socialist model, and which we are paying for indirectly by over financing NATO. So that allows them then to not paying their fair share. Well, somebody pay your fair share of taxes. What about them talking about paying their fair share of the monies in NATO? And when Trump made them do that, they were talking about how Trump is so oppressive and he's doing this and the other thing. But Trump was saying, he wasn't saying that what I'm saying here, but he was saying that they should pay their fair share. But not paying their fair share, we were actually financing the socialist model in Europe, because that allowed them to spend their money on socialist programs, because we pick up the slack in their defense. And Trump came along and began to put a stop to that. But anyway, you can look at Horowitz, and I have to give him a lot of credit, because to have been over there on the left at one point, and then now he's over there as a staunch conservative. This man is more conservative than I am.
By the way, did you see what said Lindsey Graham from South Carolina said about North Carolina? He said he admitted there was all this problems because of the the horrible conditions created by the hurricane. But then he turns around, and says, "Yeah, but we definitely got to look. But just look at the people of Israel. They got people literally trying to kill them, and we got to stand by our friends and our ally." And what does that have to do with what's going on in North Carolina and possibly your own state? You rather concentrate on a foreign power. I mean, I keep on going on about. Sorry, I interject.
No, but I'm not. I definitely understand what
I
you're
don't
saying.
understand this.
Yeah, when you mentioned his name, John, to be honest with you, I knew automatically I was not going to like it, because this man has got to be called out too. He's overboard in a lot of the claims he's making over there in South Carolina, and and they're all over the place. We got these politicians out of control in this country, and when I go into what some of the points that are made by Horowitz in the book called Final Battle, I think you'll see what we're dealing with, because we have a lot of people in power that are pulling this country down, and they're doing it under color of law, because they are the ones making the laws. So they're doing it under color of law, but they are very dangerous in the positions they have, because they're not grounded in the Constitution, which has been exiled in this country. If you take the writings of Judge Napolitano, and I do take him at his word, and we wrote in this book called The Constitution in Exile, which is an excellent book. The Constitution has been placed on hold in this country, and we have, and that's part of the final battle too. But the final battle by Horowitz, and also the book called The Enemy Within, if you don't read anything else by Horowitz, and I'm beginning to think that everything the man has written, quite frankly, is worthy of your time to read. But these two books in particular stand out. And The Enemy Within, this is a very current book. This came out in 2021. And this book, Final Battle, came out in 2022. So it's really, these books are very, very current. And to read either one is to ground you in what's taking place right now and why this election is coming up next month, as a matter of fact, November the 5th, is so this election, this may well be, I'm trying to put it into a historical context. I don't think any election we've had in this country is more important than the election that's coming up. I put this election really ahead of the election of George Washington, because there was no real critical election in 17 when George Washington was first elected in 1790, 1789, 1790, because it was already pretty much I mean, Washington was just creating the mold, but he didn't have any opposition. I mean, the factions had these political factions not been born yet, and so Washington was not really having to fight off anyone that was making a claim for the presidency, because everybody knew at the Constitutional Convention that when they were setting what they were setting up, they knew Washington was going to be the first president. I don't think anybody in the country doubted that Washington was going to be the person they put in that chair, and only had to decide at the Constitutional Convention how are you going to construct the presidency. Are you going to have a committee where it'd be a consortium of figures that would make up the executive branch, or would it be a single office holder? And finally they decided a single office holder, and of course that decision was made because of George Washington. But everybody that was at the convention knew George Washington was going to be that person. But he was not really. I mean, there was no opposition to Washington, quite frankly, in running in the two elections in which he ran. And I think it was pretty much. I mean, the mere fact that he was elected unanimously twice, 63 electoral votes in 17 in the first election in 1789 and 90. That first election was held then. There were 63 electoral votes, with 10 of the 13 states having their votes counted. The electoral votes counted, because there were 3 states of the 13 that had some things going on that did not allow them to place their ballots in time to be counted in the first election. But of the 63 votes that were counted, Washington received all the electoral votes in the election. And in the following election, in 1792, Washington would have received 163 electoral votes. So he received all electoral votes in that election as well. We'd gone from 13 states at that point to 16 states. And Washington was unanimous choice, electoral choice, in both of those elections. So I don't say Washington was the molder of in that regard. He was certainly the molder of the executive branch, and his refinement of it and placing it in the context of where we have it today. A lot of the vestiges of what Washington did, we still have today, and that for example, a 2-term limit is put in place during the Truman administration. And then in the aftermath of that, it would have kicked in, where the 2-term limit is now part of the law. Truman would have been the last president, would not have been restricted to the 2 terms under the precedent set by George Washington. But now what was set by George Washington, put in stone by the amendment that was put in place under the Truman administration. But Washington laid the mold of the presidency, but some of the particulars were outside the parameter of what Washington had to do, because Washington was really such a giant. And I'm teaching here again that Washington really I'm thinking about where you put Washington, and you put him on Mount Rushmore, but you put him on Mount Rushmore by himself. I mean, they got 4 presidents up there, but Washington belongs up there by himself. This man, this president stands out as a model of leadership, and the world had never seen anything like it. And we really have not seen anything like it since, because you have to now do some of the things I'm going to read out of Horowitz' book about how you have to now make everything statutory, because the politicians are so out of control that if you don't, in fact, have statutes that, in fact, limit them with this shall not language, then they're prone to go out of control, because they're no longer the statesman that Washington was. And Washington, by being a statesman, was able to set some things in motion just by the sheer grandeur of his persona in the presidential office, that he, in fact, held a lot of things in check just because of who he was. And you could have a lot of things, and things that he did, in fact, of standing down twice. No one had to pass a law to do that. Washington stood down from power because he was not one of those persons that was inured with power. This man was trying to do something for the country, and was very much aware that he was setting a mold for all the leaders that would follow him, and he was very much aware that he was setting a tone, and you can see him and carrying it out. Go read some of the books about Washington. The greatest of which is probably one written by another one of my favorite writers, Ron Chernow. Has a mammoth work. You're going to be there. You can't read Chernow in one day, and you're going to be there for a while reading it. But it'd be worth reading. And once you read Chernow's book on Washington, you can read other works such as Flexner's book, 2-volume work on Washington, and some other works. The work written by the author, I can't think of his name right now, but he wrote the book on the tumultuous election of 1800 between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And his book on Washington is also, what is that book called? Major book on Washington. Can't think of the name of it right now, but it's a major work. But if you read Chernow's book on Washington, really you don't have to read. You can read it. You can certainly read other books and get other angles of it. But Chernow's book is the Bible on Washington's echoes, Washington legacy. And if you read it, you don't really need to go anywhere else to read on what Washington's legacy was, because he lays it out fairly clearly and methodically in his book. Chernow's book on Washington is major. Let me read some things from Horowitz's book, The Final Battle, because we are here now as something that Washington and others were trying to avoid, and Washington was doing it without statutory limits on his own power, but was aware of the fact that he was setting a standard, and that if he in fact got it wrong, it would set an example which is wrong from that point all the way into the future. And Washington was trying to was very clear, and was trying to set it in stone a mold of how power was to be handled, so that before it was statutorily limited, other than through the check and balance system and the separation of powers, it would be limited just by the fact that Washington had put certain things into motion. And I mean, standing down was unheard of and unparalleled. It had never happened before. Where had people ever won on the battlefield, and then power would accumulate and be passed down into their hands because they're now the conquering leader, And in that aftermath of that conquest, they would stand down and give up power, as Washington did in 1783 for the first time, after the Treaty of Paris was signed and to officially end the Revolutionary War. Washington stood down from power and then went back to Mount Vernon. And 4 years later was given some direction by being there. Wasn't a delegate, but was by being at the Constitutional Convention, by being there, giving some legitimacy to what was going on there. And by showing up, that convinced him that he should at least show up at the convention, and not being sent there as a delegate. He convinced him to show up just to give some credentials to it, because he didn't have to be there, but not being there, it would not have had as much legitimacy as it had with Washington being there. And what they did once Washington arrived, they made him the president of the convention. Made him the president. He was not even a delegate. But that's the kind of statute that Washington had. And Washington gave a lot of. I tried to find in the writings of those that took notes of the convention, trying to find out what voice did Washington have at the convention. Washington said a lot at the convention. He was mostly just a presence there, and a parliamentary type of figure at the convention. But all of them were there to try to keep power in check. And what Horowitz is writing about, and he does a very good job in the first 2 chapters of his book on the final battle. The first chapter titled "Elections Matter," and you can see here that Horowitz is very much on the reason why they call that Constitutional Convention. In the first chapter, he says this is a part of the intro to the book. Now, listen to this very carefully. This is him laying out. You have to be very careful and watch the language very carefully here, because he says in the first paragraph, he says, in a constitutional democracy. He doesn't say in a democracy. He says in a constitutional democracy, elections are sacred rights. Now, you hear these politicians talking about our democracy. Horowitz is not saying that. Horowitz is saying constitutional democracy. Elections are sacred rights, sacred. They register the will of the people as sovereign and make ballot boxes the ultimate courts of appeal. That is a powerful statement. Make the ballot boxes the ultimate courts of appeal. Now, that's not in a democracy. He says that's in a constitutional democracy. And you never hear these politicians talking about a constitutional democracy. They say our democracy. I hear Tim Walz. Those guys had better not say constitutional democracy, because how you have the Democratic ticket composed right now, there was no democracy, constitutional democracy involved here. It was our democracy. Our democracy meaning that people got together in a majority voice in the ones making the decision, the majority of those figures, they made a decision, had nothing to do with the constitutional democracy, but our democracy. They keep saying our democracy. And you have to look at that very carefully, our democracy. But compare that to a constitutional democracy. There's a big difference here. Horowitz is talking about a constitutional democracy, where it is not just about majority verdicts in the decision making, but a majority voice grounded by statutory mandates. Because without that, you have something else he's talking about, and later on he'll making this point. In creating the American Republic, this Horowitz talking, its founders greatly feared the threat posed by partisan factions. Horowitz is talking about Federalist Papers 9 and 10, because in 9 and 10, the Federalist Papers talk about factions. 9 is written by Hamilton, and 10 picks up on the conversation that Hamilton started, picks up on it by James Madison, who wrote 10. And they're talking about the danger of factions. Here's Horowitz. In creating the American Republic, its founders' greatest fear was the threat posed by partisan factions. They call the threat of factions now, a tyranny of the majority. A tyranny of the majority. And feared.
Remember during Bill Clinton's era, I think it was, they had that woman named Lonnie Guinier talking about a book called The Tyranny of the Majority, and she wanted to remedy that by allowing minorities to have more than one vote for each, each one person who was a member of the minority group would actually have more like 2 or 3 or 5 votes to try to bring that up. That was they recognize on one half there's a tyranny of majority, but then the left has a tendency to want to overemphasize that part when it's advantageous to them, but then they want to keep on going back to this democracy idea. And it's like it's weird. They go jump back and forth between the lines.
Yeah, I have that book, and I read. Yeah, I met her as a matter of fact. This is the framers were very very clear about the dangers of majorities. That's what they talk about in Federalist Papers 9 and 10.
But did you think what she offered was a viable situation? I didn't think, because I thought maybe I just think she assumed because it was a person of minority would a person of minority vote in one direction, they would be excluded totally from actually trying to convince others the validity of maybe also voting that same direction. So that's what I thought.
Yeah, John, a majority, the majority is unless it's grounded. See, that's why Horowitz is very particular about the language he's using. He's not using the word democracy out there the way they're using it in Washington, where they're talking about our democracy and things like that. He's talking about a constitutional democracy. A constitutional democracy is one in which the majority is tied down. It allows majoritarian voices, but the voices are in fact restricted and restrained by statutory laws that are put in place that keeps the majority from becoming tyrannical. Because if you just have the majority voice, it's that whole story about, okay, we have a majority here, so we're going to just therefore tell the minority, where to get off. And they have no voice in it because majority is going to prevail. We got more voices over here than we have over there. So this right here will prevail. This is the prevailing view. Well, the Constitution is a constitutional republic restrains the majority, so that the majority does not do what it does just what it doesn't do what it wants to do just because it has the numbers. So the numbers have to be regulated so that the majority voice is not the ultimate word. The majority word is that which restrains it. And that's why this wording by Horowitz is so important. He's talking about a constitutional democracy. He's not just talking out here without this modifier. They want to talk without the modifier. Our democracy. Our democracy. Our is not a modifier. Our is a pronoun.
Here's a pervasive. This shows the pervasiveness of the idea of the corruption of our country is. I use ChatGPT often, to try to create titles and stuff like that. And I said about this, they'll say there's one of your programs, several of your programs, they'll say that how this is a threat to our democracy. And I always insert our republic and put that in reword it because it's our republic. But it just shows you that they have to use the technological people to actually try to repeat this lie long enough, or because it's
That's right.
If you hear it often enough, most people are just going to eliminate that as they're not going to engage in real critical search for what the true meanings were.
John, you're making a point. If you don't say constitutional democracy, you're not talking about a republic. You're talking about what they're trying to prevent. In creating the American Republic, its founders' greatest fear was a threat posed by partisan factions. And the greatest fear was of that faction that was a majority, the tyranny of the majority. Because the numbers, if that's what you're going to put in place, just what the numbers will rule today, then the sheer numbers would be the basis of the determination of what will prevail. In a constitutional republic, the Constitution prevails because the Constitution manages the majority and puts a fence around that which restrains it from simply deciding what will prevail based upon numbers. That's the tyranny we're talking about, the tyranny of the majority. Horowitz says that they called the threat a tyranny of the majority and feared that a victorious party would gain authority in all aspects of public life and use the powers of the federal government to impose a one-party state on everyone else. And Horowitz is talking about that which is going on right now, because that's what's happening right now. The threat we are facing right now is a one-party state, and that's where we're heading. That's where this country is going. And this is the danger that we're facing. This election is so important because it's going to determine how. I think we've already gone down that road. And I'm not going to say it's at a point of no return, but it's close to that. It's certainly close to that. And if we get this election wrong next month, I don't think that train that's already left the station, and I think it began to loot, they left the station. When would you date that? It left the station probably during the New Deal. When F.A. Hyatt wrote his book in 1944, which he was breaking this topic open, called The Road to Serfdom. And I think that was really the road that was that this country was placed on during the Roosevelt administration, because the New Deal, quite frankly, was all of that was almost completely unconstitutional. And Roosevelt they were trying to rein the New Deal back into its place underneath the constitutional mandates, and Roosevelt did not want to be restrained. And in 1937, you see, Roosevelt started this trying to pack the Supreme Court. Started that he tried to do that in 1937, where he's going to require a judge to be appointed to the court. Every judge that turned 70 had not retired, so we're going to pack the Supreme Court with people that would authenticate and legitimate the New Deal, rather than striking it down, because most of the New Deal was unconstitutional. What Roosevelt was doing was unconstitutional. It was not authorized by the Constitution, so it was unconstitutional. And Roosevelt did not like the idea of the court interfering with what he had in mind, which was expand government and have government doing what the majority would say it could do.
Isn't that what the Democrats are recycling that idea too, about abolishing or doing away with the Supreme Court?
That's what they're talking about,
Every
John.
time they don't get what they want to destroy the institutions they used all the time anyway to get up to that point.
They're dangerous. This is very dangerous talk we have going on. Look how dangerous I consider Tim Walsh to be very dangerous. Look what he's talking about. Walsh is talking about getting rid of the electoral college. This man is talking that out in public, and he wants to have the majority voice, whatever the numbers will determine who's the president of the United States. That's so dangerous, because you could have maybe 4 or 5 states making that decision, and the rest of the states be darned, because once you get a combination of 270, as it stands right now, 270 electoral votes, because 1/2 of the 538 elections would be 269, so a majority would be 270, and so whatever the majority would say, then that's who determines who the president would be. Tim Walsh wants to get rid of the electoral college, where it would just be whatever. Let's say you have, the last election you had, according to what they say now, they say that Biden got approximately 82 million votes, and Trump got approximately a little bit more than 74 million votes. So you add those two together, then whatever would be half of that plus 1, then that's the president. Well, that would be a majoritarian voice, but that voice is now restrained because it doesn't have to pay attention to the other voices of states that have no tie-in to that which is being decided. And the framers wanted to prevent that. They understood that was tyranny in the making. So in their brilliance, and it's a brilliant design, very few people understand it, but the design is brilliant because what it requires is that, and you can see it in the Federalist Papers that was mentioning 9 and 10, because you don't want to come out full force and squelch majorities. You don't want to squelch factions. You don't want to say they have no right to exist. But the question, how do you restrain those factions without you don't want them to go out of control, but you also don't want to create a tyrannical suppressions of their right to exist as a faction in the country. And that's what they were wrestling with at the convention. They came up with what you do is that you create the condition so that factions will be pitted against other factions, and majority factions in every one of the states have to be, in fact, included, so that enough majorities have to be put together, and that would bring about compromise by a majority of factions coming together in this state and the other states, to the point where you have today 270 electoral votes. So a consortium of large states and small states have to come together to determine the president of the United States. It cannot just be done by, you just can't get California and just the large states to do it. You have to have those small states brought into it as well. This is the design that was put in place. This faction, that faction, other factions, large states and small states, those factions of states, majorities in each of the states coming together and collectively deciding who the president would be by a majority, creating a majority of the electoral votes in a number of states. And you really have to have, as you have today, you got to have more than just look at how these candidates are in Minnesota, they're in Georgia. They're not just in New York, Texas, California. I said Florida, right? Florida. See, some other states that have those larger. You got to deal with the 16 electoral votes in Pennsylvania. Those 16 electoral votes are critical. And so you see them campaigning in a number of states because those states are necessary to reach 270. Because they put these majorities votes that are necessary to make the final and ultimate decision. Now, if it's just majority vote, you just campaign in California, you campaign in New York, you campaign in Texas. Let's see, California, of course, and you might campaign in 4 or 5 states, and you'd have enough votes to, if it's just majority vote that would win the election, just simply go and campaign the largest state, and you have enough of majority voters in 4 or 5 states, and that's where you campaign, and that's what you play to. The rest of the states are left out of it, and that creates a tyrannical situation. The framers were aware of that, and that's where they set the Electoral College up in Article 2. Brilliant. It's a brilliant design. And that sets up a constitutional democracy. You never hear them talk about constitutional democracy. You talk about our democracy. They don't. They put the pronoun in there as a modifier. Our democracy. I don't want our democracy. I want a constitutional democracy. A democracy under the rule of law. That's what Horowitz is talking about. Now, he says, this is a very important chapter. He says, the skepticism and caution of the founders reflected their Christian faith, which recognized that human beings are flawed by nature, and their ambitions, listen to this part here, are not to be trusted. The framers did not trust. We can just simply leave it up to people doing the right, what's that movie called? Do the Right Thing. People cannot be trusted to do the right thing. Washington was a man of the hour that you could. I'm glad he was up there at the top. I don't think there was another president we've had. In fact, I know we haven't had another president like George Washington. You can't trust people with power. The Constitution is written out of a distrust of power. They didn't trust people with power. Nor should they be trusted with power today. More so today than even at that time, because the government is more out of control now than it was at that time. Our government is totally out of control. And when they start talking about things like they're here for the people and they're here to protect and all that, I don't believe none of that. I don't believe any of that. They're not there to do the bidding of the people, and they have to be held to account based upon their strength, based upon their power today, more so than at that time, because our government is out of control. And Hurwitz is writing about what needs to happen today, based upon where we are. And for example, he has a part of chapter 1 is the Carter-Baker Commission attempts to fix the problem. What is the problem? The problem is government no longer under the restraints of the Constitution. That's a problem we have right now. Among their key conclusions of the Carter-Baker Commission that was set up, because Carter, the Democrat, and Baker, the Republican, come together to decide that we have a problem in this country going on right now, and we have to understand the nature of this problem. The problem is that we have people that are trying to create a one-party state. Hurwitz says among their key conclusions of the Baker-Carter Commission, among their key conclusions were recommendations to increase voter ID requirements. You notice they're trying to get away from voter ID. They're telling us that voter ID is repressive and racist. I mean, that should be an insult. Telling people that requiring voter ID. Why do you think they're doing that, by the way? The voter ID should not be a requirement for voting, and it's too prohibitive in having people voting freely in American elections. Now, do you think that's really the reason behind why they're trying to get away from voter ID? Why do you think that they're doing that? What is that about, you think? To have people go to the polls, but they're being suppressed if they have to produce some voter identification. You think that's the reason behind them trying to get away from voter ID? They got away from the Baker-Carter recommendations, which is that we increase voter ID requirements to minimize the use of, and also to minimize the use of mail-in ballots. What do you think mail-in ballots are about? Or what is all of this forever voting about, you think? Where you just never stop voting. You start voting in September. You continue voting through September. You vote through October, and voting finally ends on the 5th of November, rather than having voting on a single day. If they're serious about having fair elections in the country, quite frankly, and you're not going to have a one-party state. You're going to have all the voices included, and you will, in fact, make sure that the votes are, in fact, legitimate votes, and that would be the votes that would be counted legitimately based upon people overlooking and overseeing that the votes will be counted based upon one man, one vote, one woman, one vote. You wouldn't have ballot harvesting, which you had that in 2020. You had that in the 2016 election. You really have had that ever since they started to go away from voting in a single day. You just have this for voting. What is that about? What do you think they're doing by having forever voting? Well, they're just voting for 2.5 months. Does it take that much time to determine who the president's going to be? So no ballot harvesting. Can we say that? That's one recommendation that were recommended by the Carter Baker Committee to minimize the use of mail-in ballots. To mail ballots in, you don't even know who the persons are mailing the ballots in, and then just send them out there like they did in 2020, and just send ballots out there without them being even requested. What do you think the reason for that was? Harvard makes the point by 2019, a year before the Biden-Trump election contest, the country had become so politically polarized that Democrats launched a massive campaign to change the election laws. Now, you can change election laws, but the election laws can only be changed, according to Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2, can only be changed by the legislative branch of those states. If they had done that in 2020, there would have been no need to go to Washington to stand against the election returns, because the election returns would have been following the mandates in the Constitution. But that's not what they did. That's not what Mike Pence did. Mike Pence should have sent those votes back to those states to have them to redo that process. And they're holding him up as having.
You know what? I just realized how tough Trump has been, because not only he did get shot, but he's been walking around for a couple of years now with a knife in his back that Pence put in there.
That's right. Mike Pence was a cancer on the. So that's another thing that we have to look at too, is that not all the ones that when Trump was running, Trump was running against both parties, but not all the ones that were against Trump ran away from Trump to campaign against him. Some ran to him. Mike Pence was one of them. Some of them went to join Trump's administration, not to be on board with what Trump was doing, but to go into the administration to contain what Trump was trying to do. Because Trump was running against the status quo, where the status quo was, in fact, doing the American people in. They were not following the Constitution. Trump was trying to drain, he kept saying, drain the swamp. Well, there would be no swamp if they were following the Constitution, because the Constitution was, in fact, standing against what they're doing in Washington. Washington is a swamp. And Trump was running against the swamp. And he was running against the swamp, therefore running against both parties, because both parties is on both sides of the political aisle, and they were trying to stop Donald Trump. And they were trying to stop him inside the Republican Party, and they certainly were trying to stop him in the Democratic Party. But those in the Republican Party are trying to stop him also. They'd be more careful in the Republican Party because Donald Trump was running as a Republican. And so now we have come to the end of this is the end of the road. Trump's recognition, talking about what Horowitz is writing, Trump's recognition of this gut-wrenching fact was accompanied by another. The knowledge that in 5 of the 6 battleground states, 5 of the 6 battleground states, Republican majorities ruled, listen to this part here, the legislatures, but had refused to enforce the constitutional provisions that would have declared the Democrat rules unconstitutional and secured Trump's victory. 5 of those 6 states were Republican states. 5 of the 6 had Republican governors, and they had changed the rules of how the elections ought to be run in those states because they too, under the radar, were trying to stop Donald Trump. Because I understand now that Donald Trump was given no chance to win in 2016. And he won in 2016 anyway, running against both parties, but wanting to be more careful in how they were coming out to stop him. But they did not succeed in it because the people were voting for change. And Donald Trump was running from the outside, and he was the agent of change at that point. And that change is going to bring to Washington is going to be a change in terms of an effect upon both parties, Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party. But the Republican Party was more careful in how they were trying to stop Donald Trump, but they were trying to stop him also. And that's why they went to Washington to stop the steal. And now we are 4 years beyond that point. And now here we are at the final battle, is what Horowitz is talking about, the final battle. This final battle is going to be whether or not we come out to stop what's happening right now. Because if we don't stop it now, if it's not stopping this election, you will have a one-party state. If this election breaks the wrong way, you'll have a one-party state, which they're creating that right now in Washington and in America. If it's not stopped in this election, it cannot be stopped because that's where we're heading right now. And that's why Horowitz is talking about the final battle. This is the final battle in 2024. Okay, I have to get out of here. Hope you will, in fact, stay tuned. Very important election next month. We got about 3 weeks before we make the final decision. And that decision is the most crucial decision this country is making, because what the framers are trying to prevent is now they've broken away from it. And we're now at that hour they tried to keep from coming. And we're here now. And we got to now vote in record numbers to stop this train because it's already left the station. Okay, until next week, I want you to follow your dream. If you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.